What if I told you that in the darkest hours of the 20th century, a single sheet of paper, a single signature, could have erased the United States of America from the map? Not conquered, not defeated in battle, erased. Pushed into the sea, fractured into pieces, its cities reduced to glowing craters, its government a ghost hiding in the Rocky Mountains. We know how World War II ended, but you don't know how close it came to ending the other way. This isn't a story about a lost battle. This is the story of a secret plan, a plan so audacious, so terrifying, that it was buried for decades in a vault in Tokyo. A plan that wasn't about winning a war, it was about ending a nation forever. What was this plan? Who designed it? And what stopped it from turning North America into a graveyard? The answers are hidden in the silence of the deep ocean, in the frozen tundra of Alaska, and in the mind of a single man who held the fate of the world in his trembling hands. The year is 1942. The world is on fire. But right now, in this moment, the flames are not touching the shores of California. The Pacific Ocean is a vast, shimmering blue barrier, a peaceful expanse separating the American mainland from the industrial-scale slaughter happening on the islands of the South Pacific. Americans feel the war in their ration books, in the absence of new tires, in the gold stars hanging in front windows. But they don't feel the earth shake. They don't hear the roar of heavy artillery on their morning commutes. There is a quiet, unspoken assumption that the two massive oceans are impassable shields. The Atlantic protects the East Coast from Hitler's wolf packs. The Pacific protects the West Coast from the Japanese Empire. This assumption is the single greatest strategic weakness of the United States, because beneath that shimmering blue water, a dark logic is stirring. In the war rooms of Tokyo, a group of strategists are not celebrating their victory at Pearl Harbor. They are terrified of what they have awakened. They know the American industrial machine is a sleeping giant, and they have just kicked it in the teeth. They understand, with cold, mathematical precision, that Japan cannot win a long war against infinite oil fields and assembly lines that stretch from Detroit to Chicago. They need a shortcut. They need a psychological weapon so devastating that the American public would demand a truce out of sheer, visceral fear. They need a plan that bypasses the Navy, bypasses the Army, and strikes directly at the soul of the nation. And they think they have found it. But who would be crazy enough to lead it, and what was the price of such an operation? The answer to that question would lead to a quiet morning in a small fishing village in Oregon, where the sound of a distant airplane engine would soon turn into a screaming nightmare. The Pacific War did not start with a declaration. It started with a lie wrapped in diplomatic code, delivered while dive bombers were already screaming down over Battleship Row. December 7th, 1941, shattered the American illusion of isolation. But for Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of that attack, there was no champagne. He had studied at Harvard. He had toured the Detroit auto plants. He had seen the sheer, overwhelming scale of American industrial might. He famously wrote, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Yamamoto knew that the clock was ticking. To win, Japan had to destroy the US Navy's aircraft carriers, which happened to be out of port during the raid, and then push so far east that America's head would spin before it could throw a punch. But someone in the Imperial Japanese Navy looked at the map differently. Most admirals looked at Midway Island. This other man looked at the Aleutian Islands, a fog-shrouded chain of volcanic rock stretching from Alaska toward Japan like a trail of frozen crumbs. He traced his finger east, past the naval bases, past the coastal defenses, and tapped directly on the glass over California. The question wasn't, can we invade? The question was, what happens if we just terrify them? What happens if we burn their forests, bomb their factories, and panic their population? What happens if we turn the American home front into a battlefield? This was not the thinking of a conventional soldier. This was the thinking of a man who understood that a population gripped by primal terror will demand safety at any cost, even surrender. To understand how a plan to cripple the American West Coast was even considered, you have to step into the shoes of a nation that believed it had a divine mandate to rule the Pacific. Early 1942 was a tsunami of Japanese victories. Hong Kong fell. Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, surrendered in humiliation. The American garrison in the Philippines was starving on Bataan. The British battleship Prince of Wales and the battle cruiser Repulse were sent to the bottom of the South China Sea, proving that the age of the battleship was over. The Japanese soldier was seen as a jungle superman, a warrior monk who could march endless miles on a handful of rice and fight with a ferocity that terrified the Western allies. For a brief, terrifying window, the Japanese empire seemed unstoppable. The perimeter was expanding so fast that the high command in Tokyo started looking for the next domino. Should they push into India and link up with Hitler? Should they cut Australia off from the rest of the world? Or should they punch east, directly into the belly of the beast? The strategic map looked like a nightmare for the Allies. Japan held the Central Pacific, blocking any line of communication to Australia. The US Navy was battered. But among the suicide torpedoes and the island-hopping strategies, a darker concept began to crystallize. It wasn't just about seizing resource-rich territories like the Dutch East Indies anymore. It was about making the war so painful for American civilians that they would vote their leaders out of office. What if you could bypass the fighting men and attack the kitchen tables? What if you could turn the Pacific Ocean from a shield into a highway for terror? This concept gave birth to a series of operations that history books often dismiss as footnotes, but together they formed a chilling tapestry of psychological warfare aimed at the American heartland. But the real truth was far stranger than bombing cities. The first seeds of the Grand Terror Plan were not conventional weapons, they were balloons, so simple it sounds like a joke. But the Japanese fire balloon campaign, known as Fugo, was history's first intercontinental weapon delivery system. The concept was diabolical. Scientists in Japan realized that a high-altitude jet stream existed, a river of wind blowing from west to east at 30,000 feet. By crafting 33-foot diameter balloons made of mulberry paper, fueled with hydrogen, and attaching timed barometric sandbags to control altitude, the Japanese could launch floating bombs that would drift silently across the entire Pacific Ocean. The payload was not just a high-explosive bomb. It was often an incendiary device, designed to land in the vast, dry forests of the Pacific Northwest. And here is where the story shifts into a chilling what if. The Japanese launched roughly 9,300 of these ghost bombs. They floated, invisible to radar, silent as a whisper, across 6,000 miles of empty ocean. Days later, they began to arrive. One landed in Montana. Another exploded in Nebraska. Fragments were found from Alaska to Mexico. But the US government did something incredible. They didn't tell the public. The Office of Censorship, run by the sharp-eyed editors of the time, asked the press to kill the story completely. The reasoning was brilliant and terrifying. If the Japanese knew the balloons were landing, they would perceive the attack as a success. If the balloons were carrying biological weapons instead of just fire bombs, they could trigger a plague epidemic. The silence was total. American citizens picked up mysterious rubberized silk canopies in their fields with zero idea they were Japanese weapons. The sleeping giant didn't even know it had been touched. But Yamamoto's strategists weren't satisfied with balloons. They wanted boots on the ground. And then something shifted in the high command. A faction emerged that believed the balloon campaign was a waste of silk if it wasn't followed by a psychological hammer blow. If you want to truly break the American will, they argued, you cannot just start forest fires. You have to invade their land. You have to kill their children. You have to force the president to look out the White House window and feel the shadow of the rising sun. This was not a fantasy. This was the genesis of a plan that would require the complete abandonment of the Southern offensive strategy, the stripping of the Manchurian defense lines against the Soviet Union, and the total mobilization of the Japanese combined fleet. It was a plan that, if launched, would have changed the map of North America permanently, and it revolved around a single fanatical admiral whose ambition was matched only by his strategic genius. His name was not Isoroku Yamamoto, though Yamamoto commanded the fleet. The main figure pushing for the insanity of an Eastern strike was often shadowed behind the Imperial General Staff, but the most detailed and terrifying version of the plan came from a concept known as the Great Eastern Forward Offensive. It wasn't just a raid, it was a three-pronged assault designed to dismember the United States. The figure often associated with this unbridled aggression was the Japanese army's northern clique, men who saw the vast wilderness of Siberia and Alaska not as obstacles, but as bases. They were soldiers who had fought in the brutal cold of Manchuria. They believed the American spirit was weak because American soldiers expected 3 meals a day and a warm bed. They humanized the conflict as a battle between the Spartan Japanese spirit and the decadent, materialistic American flesh. But we have to look at the man who would have to sign the final order. Admiral Yamamoto, the American-educated gambler, was a realist. He told the Imperial General Staff bluntly that he could run wild for 6 months, maybe a year. After that, he guaranteed nothing. Yet, he was a disciplined officer. If the Emperor commanded an invasion of California, Yamamoto would draw up the tactical blueprint, and that blueprint is what keeps military historians up at night. The plan wasn't just to sail across the Pacific and land at Santa Monica. It was a coordinated, multi-vector strike aimed at destroying the triangle of power, the West Coast industrial base, the Panama Canal, and the psychological heart of the nation. It's a document that reads like a thriller novel, except the targets were real cities with millions of living souls. The first stage was the decapitation of Alaska. The Japanese attacked Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands in June 1942, and they actually seized the islands of Attu and Kiska. This is not fiction. American soil was occupied. For a full year, American and Canadian troops fought a brutal, frozen, forgotten war to eject them. But in the secret plan, the Aleutians weren't just a diversion. They were the left flank. The plan detailed a full-scale assault on Anchorage, or even the construction of bomber bases in western Alaska. From these frozen runways, Japanese long-range bombers, had they been developed in time, could have reached Seattle, Portland, and Vancouver. Imagine the midnight air raid sirens, not in London, but in downtown Seattle. Imagine the Space Needle, had it existed, silhouetted against the glow of burning docks. The plan was to turn the last frontier into a launching pad for terror. But what happened next in the plan was worse, much worse. While Alaska burned, the Imperial Navy would launch a decisive battle somewhere off the coast of California. This wasn't Midway. Midway was a trap for the American carriers. This was a naval blitzkrieg. The super battleship Yamato, the largest and most heavily armored vessel ever to float at the time, would lead a bombardment fleet. Target, San Diego. San Diego was not just a pretty beach city. It was the home of the U.S. Pacific Fleet's repair docks and naval air stations. The Japanese plan understood a simple truth. If you destroy the dry docks, you cripple the American ability to repair ships for 18 months. The Yamato's 18.1-inch guns would fire shells the weight of a small car, turning the naval base into a cratered, burning junkyard. Simultaneously, carrier-based bombers would strike the oil refineries of Long Beach. In 1942, the West Coast had almost no blackout procedures. The refineries would have looked like a glowing beacon under the California moon. And then, the real horror, the third stage. Invasion. Not of California first, but of the Panama Canal zone. The plan recognized the canal as the jugular vein of the U.S. Navy. If Japan seized the locks or destroyed them with a specially designed submarine-launched aircraft attack, the US fleet in the Atlantic would take months to steam around South America to reach the Pacific. During those months, the West Coast would be completely isolated. Troops could not be brought from the East Coast. Oil could not flow. The strategic isolation would force the US government to either negotiate a peace keeping the West Coast a demilitarized zone or watch it starve of fuel and ammunition. It was a calculated, cold-blooded attack on the circulatory system of American power. But an invasion requires more than ships. It requires men who are willing to die. The Japanese army's vision for the actual landings was grim. They knew they couldn't conquer the entire continental United States with bayonets alone. The real target was the psychology of the American people. The plan envisioned a landing in the Gulf of Mexico or even a sacrificial division landing on the beaches of Southern California. They didn't intend to march to Chicago. They intended to commit an atrocity so massive that the American public would be paralyzed with fear. The model was the rape of Nanking, a massacre so brutal that it still haunts international relations decades later. The Japanese ultra-nationalists believed that American society was soft and that a sudden, violent shock of mass civilian executions, reminiscent of the burning fields of China, would trigger a breakdown of morale. They wanted to force Roosevelt to pull troops back from Europe to defend the homeland. They wanted to break the Germany first strategy. And that brings us to the terrifying question, why didn't they? What static in the machine, what whisper of failure, what shadow in the code stopped the rising sun from setting in the Pacific? The turning point was not a battle, it was a room. A basement room, specifically in Pearl Harbor, known as Station Hypo. The code breakers. Throughout history, cryptographers have been the silent ghosts that changed the tide of wars. And in the spring of 1942, a group of American intelligence officers, working around the clock, smelling of sweat and cigarettes, staring at strings of random letters intercepted from the airwaves, were piecing together the Japanese Navy's secret code, JN-25. They couldn't read everything. Maybe 10 or 15% of the traffic was legible. But it was enough. A specific geographic location kept popping up, AF. The Japanese were planning a massive strike on AF. Commander Joseph Rushforth, the eccentric genius running the operation, was certain F meant Midway Island. Washington wasn't so sure. They feared it could be a feint for the real target, perhaps the West Coast plan itself. To prove their theory, the Americans executed one of the most elegant tricks in the history of espionage. They told the Midway garrison to broadcast an unencrypted, low-level radio message. The message stated that the island's water distillation plants had broken down. It was a trap. 2 days later, the painstaking American listeners in the dark room intercepted a Japanese intelligence message. It was brief, deadly, and exactly what they needed. The message read simply, AF is short of water. The trap snapped shut. Admiral Chester Nimitz now knew the target was Midway. He knew the date, and he knew the Japanese fleet composition. The secret plan for a direct strike on the mainland was now irrelevant. To pave the way to Hawaii or California, Japan had to destroy the American carriers, and at Midway they hoped to do just that. But because of that broken water pipe message, the ambush was reversed. And while the codes were being cracked, another failure was brewing in the Japanese high command. They were consumed by what military theorists call victory disease. They had won so much so fast that they began to underestimate their enemy. The army wanted to push into India. The navy wanted to push into Australia. The Eastern Forward Offensive was debated fiercely, but it ran into an immovable wall of logistics. Japan simply did not have the cargo ships to supply an expeditionary force across the vast Pacific to occupy American soil. The oil fields of the Dutch East Indies hadn't been fully repaired. Tokyo realized with a sinking dread that a one-way suicide mission to burn Los Angeles might make for glorious propaganda, but they couldn't hold the city. They couldn't hold a single city. The plan shifted from permanent occupation to strategic devastation. But even that required fuel. And the fuel tankers were being sunk by American submarines at an alarming rate. Then came the hammer blow of Midway itself. In the space of 5 minutes, the pride of the Japanese carrier fleet, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were burning pyres on the Pacific Ocean. The pilots who were supposed to strike Pearl Harbor again, or perhaps strike the California oil fields, were now sinking into the abyss. The shift was instantaneous and brutal. On June 4, 1942, Japan had the naval power to project force anywhere. By June 7th, they were on the permanent defensive. The secret plan didn't die because of a lack of ambition. It died because America, in a dark basement, heard the whispers of the enemy and moved a fleet to the exact right spot in the vast, empty water. The invasion of America was not stopped on the beaches. It was stopped on the drawing board of the codebreakers. But the shadow of the plan didn't vanish immediately. The escalation continued in the minds of the Japanese holdouts. You have to remember, Midway was a secret kept from the Japanese public. The Imperial General Staff announced a great victory in the Aleutians while burying the truth of the carrier losses. And in the desperate months following Midway, as the tide turned, the wild fantasies of a West Coast invasion mutated into something smaller but even more terrifying. If they couldn't invade, they would infiltrate. If they couldn't bomb, they would burn. This period marked the escalation of terror weapons and irregular warfare, taking the strategic intent of the secret plan and shrinking it down to a scalpel. The escalation phase reveals just how far Japan was willing to go. The fire balloon campaign, launched primarily in late 1944 and early 1945, was the direct descendant of the invasion plan. It was the poor man's intercontinental bomber, and the government knew a single lucky strike could change the war's narrative. Here is a chilling detail. Japanese scientists at Unit 731, the notorious biological and chemical warfare research facility in Manchuria, explored weaponizing anthrax and plague-infected fleas for the balloons. The plan, called Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night, was to drop plague bombs on San Diego. This wasn't a fringe idea. It was set to be launched in September 1945 to coincide with the final suicidal kamikaze-style naval strategy. The scale of biological warfare contemplated would have filled American hospitals with a medieval nightmare, turning the Golden State into a death zone. And what about the kamikaze attacks themselves? The special attack units were not just for smashing into aircraft carriers. As the lines of defense were drawn closer to Japan, the military modified thousands of planes, mini-subs, and even human-guided torpedoes. The Shinyo suicide boats were packed with explosives and hidden in coves to ram invasion landing craft. The plan for the defense of Kyushu, Operation Ketsugo, was aimed at American invaders. But imagine the same fanatical logic applied the other way. If Japan had captured a beachhead in California, the American public would not have faced a uniformed enemy digging trenches. They would have faced waves of soldiers taught that surrender was a disgrace worthy of death. The secret plan assumed that the sheer nihilistic shock of fighting an enemy who welcomed death would send a seismic shudder through the American psyche, which viewed individual life as sacred. It was a clash of civilizations where the battlefield would have been suburban backyards and orange groves. The climax of this secret plan didn't happen on American soil, but it happened to the plan itself. The final act of this tension occurred on April 18, 1943. The architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was the living symbol of Japanese naval power. He was the sword hanging over the Pacific. American intelligence intercepted his flight plan. He was making a morale-boosting tour of the Solomon Islands. The message was clear. Yamamoto would be an Abeti bomber, escorted by 6 fighters at exactly 9:35 a.m. President Roosevelt himself reportedly authorized the mission. A squadron of long-range P-38 Lightning fighters flew 400 miles at wave-top height, skimming the sea at 50 feet to avoid radar. They arrived exactly 1 minute early. And then they executed a kill shot. Yamamoto's plane was shot down over the jungle of Bougainville. The man who calculated a path to California was dead in the jungle mud. The intellectual author of the Eastern Expansion was removed from the equation. This was the climax of the silent war. It wasn't a naval battle. It was an assassination born from a broken code, a surgical strike that cut the head off the snake. The detailed tactical knowledge of U.S. weaknesses, the potential routes for a West Coast strike, died with him in the burning wreckage. But the climax of the terror campaign on the American homeland has its own dark peak. It happened on a gentle, pine-scented hillside near Bly, Oregon. On May 5, 1945, a pregnant woman named Elsie Mitchell and her 5 children from a Sunday school class were out for a spring picnic. They parked their car and walked into the woods. The children stumbled upon something strange on the forest floor. A large, papery balloon, partially deflated with ropes and shiny metal bits attached. It looked like a broken toy, a fallen piece of the moon. As they approached, perhaps reaching out a hand to touch the strange object, it detonated. Elsie Mitchell, age 26, and all 5 children, Dick Patsky, Jay Gifford, Edward Engen, Joan Patsky, and Sherman Shoemaker, were killed instantly. They are the only known civilian casualties of enemy action on the United States mainland during World War II. The silence that followed was a horrified epilogue to the Foucault campaign. The government could no longer keep the secret. The warning was finally issued. The phantom weapon had drawn blood, not in a factory, not in a port, but in the soft innocence of a Sunday school picnic. The secret plan to terrorize the American psyche had found its victims, a quiet echo of the devastating fear Tokyo had hoped to unleash on a massive scale. When the guns fell silent in Tokyo Bay in September 1945, the world entered a new age. The occupation forces began the slow, painstaking process of unearthing the plans of the Imperial General Staff. In the burnt-out ruins of government ministries, in the filing cabinets of underground bunkers, they found the blueprints. They found the maps of the Gulf of Mexico. They found the fuel calculations for the carrier strike on the Panama Canal. They found the schematics for the biological delivery systems for Operation Cherry Blossoms at night. The aftermath was a collective silent sigh of relief from the Allied intelligence community. The magnitude of what had been barely avoided settled in. The war had been brutal, costing millions of lives, but the face of the conflict could have been entirely different. The Pacific Ocean had not just been a battlefield, it had been a deadline. The German V-2 rockets were raining on London, but they couldn't cross the Atlantic. The Japanese had developed the technology to bridge the Pacific Gap, and the only thing that failed them was time and a lack of heavy bombers. The aftermath also revealed the terrifying fragility of American coastal defenses in early 1942. The Battle of Los Angeles, the famous Great LA Air Raid of February 1942, suddenly made a different kind of sense. In the hours after midnight, unidentified objects were reported over the city. Searchlights crisscrossed the sky. Anti-aircraft batteries fired over 1,400 shells into the blackness, creating a massive light show of flak. Panic grips the city. In the morning, no enemy planes were found. It was dismissed as war nerves, a false alarm. But in the context of the secret invasion plans, we have to ask, was it just nerves? Or was it a probing of American reaction time? While the government called it a weather balloon, the paranoia proved that the psychological ground was fertile. If Tokyo had substituted a real bomber wing for a stray balloon that night, the shells would have been useless. The American public was not ready. The psychological defenses were paper-thin. And here lies the deeper, more unsettling legacy of this secret plan. It wasn't just about military bases or oil fields. It was about the internal fracture of American society. The plan heavily relied on the assumption that the American Union was weak, that racial tensions, labor strikes, and isolationist politics would boil over the moment a foreign army touched the sacred soil. The Japanese strategists had studied the 1943 Detroit race riots from afar. They read about the Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles. They believed the United States was a fragile experiment, a nation of squabbling ethnicities that would turn on each other the second the federal government showed weakness. They were wrong. The attack on Pearl Harbor unified the country overnight in a way that no political speech ever could. The isolationist movement collapsed into silence. The industrial output doubled, then tripled. The plan failed because it was analyzing a version of America that existed only in propaganda caricature. But the frightening truth is that for a few weeks in 1942, the generals in Tokyo were betting the entire empire on the assumption that this caricature was real. They gambled that Americans would choose survival over principle. The silence of the balloon bombs, the concealment of the invasion scares, was actually a profound act of faith by the Roosevelt administration. They believed that if they could just hold the line long enough, the system would correct, the ships would launch, and the public would stand firm. The world we live in now is built on the bones of these ghost invasions. The interstate highway system, partially justified by the need to move military equipment quickly if the coasts were invaded or bombed. The massive infrastructure of the Cold War, the radar stations stretching across the Arctic, the NORAD command centers buried deep inside mountains. These are the grandchildren of the fear that bloomed in 1942. When a nation realizes that geography is no longer a shield, it does not sleep well. It builds, it scans the horizon. The Japanese secret plan didn't change the outcome of World War II. But it permanently changed the psychology of American defense. Never again would two wide oceans feel like a safe mode. The sky had eyes, the deep sea had silent submarines. The panic of the burning West was not a historical footnote, it was a paradigm shift. A single question lingers like smoke over a ruined engine. What keeps the barbarians at the gate? Is it strength? Is it genius? Or is it simple, dumb luck? The story we tell ourselves about World War II is a story of inevitable victory, of righteous steel crushing a vile ideology, but inevitability is a lie we write after the fact. If a water pump hadn't broken on Midway, if a code hadn't been cracked in a basement, if a single pilot hadn't spotted a shadow above the jungles of Bougainville, the map you know, the towns you've driven through, the coastlines you've walked along, might exist today in a different language. The secret plan that could have changed World War II forever was not a fantasy, it was a loaded gun. And the trigger was pressed, it just failed to fire. History is not defined by what did happen, it is haunted by what almost did. And the ghost of the burning coast still flickers in the fog of the Aleutian Sea, a silent warning that peace is only ever one breath away from chaos. The hidden pages of history are the ones we should be most afraid of, because they remind us that sometimes the only thing between civilization and the abyss is a story of luck whispered in a code over a silent sea.